Today's presentation is really going to focus on the updated roles and responsibilities for supervisors of attendance, as well as the process of SARB, and this will serve as SARB certification for the county. So we're kind of multitasking. We're doing a couple different things during the course of the day. It'll be a lot of information. For those of you who've been doing this work for a long time, it may be a refresher. There may be some new pieces that you were not aware of. We'll go through those and talk about those. Some of you may be really comfortable with this. For some of you who may be newer to your positions, this could be a lot of information. It might take you a little while to process. And if you have questions, please feel free to do so. For the workshop objectives, we have a couple of things that we're really going to focus on during the course of our time together today. So one is to talk about the current context and focus on education. Why all of a sudden, we've all been dealing with attendance for years and years and years, right? But in the past 5 or 6 years, there's really been an increased focus and awareness on attendance. And we'll talk about what some of the things were that kind of led to that and led us to the point where now we have this updated roles and responsibilities of supervisors of attendance. So when that was first put into the books in 1975, supervisors of attendance, it was really focused on being more of kind of a compliance officer. And we'll talk about the shift from that role to what we're looking at now as the assigned duties and responsibilities of attendance supervisors. We're also going to review the SARB process and what that looks like. And I kind of bolded the word process because sometimes when people think of SARB, they think of the actual SARB meeting and that kind of being it. The reality is that SARB is a process, because to get to the SARB meeting, there are some steps that need to happen prior to that. So we're going to talk about the notification requirements, the conferencing, best practices related to SARB, and then getting through to the part where we're having those student attendance review teams and the actual SARB meetings. And then beyond that, what happens when you move into the legal arena. So we're going to talk about that as a process. And we're also going to share best practices and resources related to attendance improvement. Again, on your flash drive, you have over 400 things that you can kind of start with and take a look at. I have some materials that we'll pass around during the course of the presentation as well. And then probably the best resources is the information that you're going to share with each other. So during the course of today, it's not going to be 6 hours of me talking at you. That's not fun for anybody. We're going to spend some time working together collaboratively, sharing out ideas, talking about what you're doing that works, because people may be able to pick up on those ideas as well. I have some information that we'll share too, but we'll make sure that we utilize our board over here. Sal's going to be my helper, and make sure that we get that up so that you have a chance to kind of look at that and take that away with you. So again, the purpose of this is, yes, we need to certify you through the county for this work, but we also want to make sure that you're able to walk away with things that you can put in place immediately. That's really our goal for today. So before we get too far into the presentation, I want to make sure that we are all kind of speaking the same language related to attendance. We have some terms that are relatively new, and we have some that are very easily confused. So I want to make sure that before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything, that we're really looking at what do these terms mean and make sure that we're applying them appropriately. Key attendance terms, here are the terms that we look at and focus on when we're talking about attendance. Compulsory ed, chronic absentee, truant, habitual truant, and chronic truant. So we'll get into these in a little more detail. The education codes that define these are listed there for you. Sometimes when you're having meetings with staff or with parents, they'll question you about where these terms come from and what they mean. So in terms of easy access, this is kind of a nice slide for you to have available at your desk to be able to refer to if that ever comes up. But we'll go into them a little bit more. So compulsory education, Ed Code 48200. This is kind of an abridged definition because it's very, very long and convoluted. But a pupil between the ages of 6 and 18 who is not otherwise exempted shall attend school for the full time designated as the length of the school day by the governing board. So taking a look at that definition, what are some issues that you can see that would come up as a result of that? Kinder. Okay. What's the issue with kinder? Okay. So a lot of kids in your kinder program start out, they're 5 years old. What if you run TK programs? They're even younger, okay? So you have kids on your campuses that are 4 and 5 years old that are not covered under the compulsory education piece. So sometimes when you're attempting to do interventions and working with families and saying for your young ones, the students are not coming to school, they're missing out, they're falling behind, you may have some parents who push back and say, why are we meeting? Why are you talking to me? What's the issue with this? My child's not 6 years old anyway. Now, want to explain to you that with compulsory education, it does begin in terms of being age 6, but the thing is, it's for part of the SARB process. When you're looking at the very end, tail end of it, the prosecution piece and doing any of those kinds of things, you wouldn't be able to take a case forward for legal recourse for any student who's under the age of 6. But it doesn't mean you don't contact the parents or you don't do interventions. Those things still take place. So you may have some parents who push back on you a little bit, but that's something that you should still be doing with them. What's another issue that might come up with this? Anything else that when they turn 18? So what's the issue with when they turn 18? What happens at 18? Okay, the rights turn over from the parents to the student. So you have students who would be able to write their own absence notes. Okay, so compulsory education, and this is kind of tricky because every year you'll see people who are trying to put forward pieces of legislation to tweak this, because realizing we have younger kids on school, we have kids who may be on your campuses a little older than this. Lots of people throw out ideas and proposals for how to adjust this. It hasn't gotten very far. We've had the same definition for a really long time. So maybe at some point that will happen. But right now, this is what we're working with. So we know that even with compulsory ed, there are a couple challenges, but we still are able to work within our system to be able to address that. Chronic absentee. So probably not an educator who came up with this one, but essentially when you break this down into something that is a little more manageable, what would you tell us, Brian? What's a shortened version?
You're absent for any reason, 10% or more.
Perfect. 10% or more of the days that you're enrolled in school. That's when you really break it down, that's what we're looking at. And one thing that people need to be aware of is that chronic absentees include excused absences, unexcused absences, and suspensions. So in the past, maybe 10 years ago, we were really focused on truancy, those unexcused absences. That's how we were addressing kids. If you had unexcused absences, those were problematic. Those were the kids that would end up in SART and SARB meetings. Those were the challenges because they were unexcused. We didn't know where they were, why they were missing school. But the reality is, kids missing school for any reason, whether it's excused or unexcused, you're losing instructional time. You're losing those social emotional kind of connections, or developmental pieces when kids are missing that amount of school. So we had to start looking at it beyond just the unexcused absences to kind of a broader version of what it means when kids are out. So this definition includes excused absences, unexcused absences, and also suspensions because their kids are off campus. So when you think about it as a site person, if you're here representing a site position, an administrator, when you're making determinations about whether a student should be suspended or not, realize that that decision is going to impact your data in a couple of different ways. One, it'll impact your suspension data. The second thing is it'll impact your attendance data. Because when kids are off campus, those suspension days are included in a chronic absenteeism. This is not to say that you should not suspend kids. Please don't walk away saying, this lady told me that it's not good to do this. Clearly there are reasons that students need to be removed from campus. However, just realize that the impact of that is going to be beyond just your suspension data. It's going to be your attendance data as well. So in thinking about chronic absenteeism, there's a few things that I want you to keep in mind as well. When this definition first came out, I think there was a little bit of confusion because people were looking at it through the course of a school year. So they were saying most schools run a 180-day school year, so 10% of that is 18 days. So a student becomes a chronic absentee 18 days. The reality is the definition here that Brian shared is chronic absentee is a student who is absent 10% of the days enrolled. So you have to look at this as a rolling target. You don't wait until a student has 18 days to designate them as a chronic absentee. The example I gave is if you're 30 days into the school year, any student with 3 or more absences for any reason is considered a chronic absentee. So this is something you have to look at from the very start of school. And according to Sal, all of the school districts in the room have started already. So whether you started at the end of July, whether you started last week, you need to be looking at this data already, because your kids who have missed 1-2 days of school, they could potentially already be a chronic absentee. And that's part of the early warning systems that we'll talk about a little bit later that need to be in place so that you can address this right away. You can't wait until a student hits 18 days and say, well, now you're a chronic absentee. It's a rolling target as you go. So with that, you're going to have kids, as you're pulling up reports through your student information system, you're going to have kids who come off and on that list frequently. So at any given point in time, if you pulled the list right now of who your chronic absentees were, you might have 40, 50 kids, depending on the size of your school, your district. But in another 10, 20 days, that list could be a completely different list based on who had absences during that time, how many more days of attendance there were, those types of things. So if you're the person responsible for looking at data and pulling reports and sharing that information out and starting those interventions, you have to look at this on a regular basis. Okay, questions about chronic absenteeism? Okay. In terms of truancy, so this is a definition that we're probably all a little more comfortable or familiar with, because this is what we've been looking at for years and years and years. The reason that we're focusing still on truancy is because we have concerns about kids who are out of school for unexcused reasons or for invalid reasons. And also because as school districts, we are required to notify a parent if they are in violation of California's compulsory education law. That's where those truancy notifications kick in. Sometimes parents will ask, why do you send me this letter? It sounds so harsh. It sounds, it's scary when people open it. Because we're required by law to make sure that parents are notified if their child is in violation of compulsory ed law. And also within education code, it's very specific about what information has to be included in that initial letter. We'll talk more about how some districts have reframed it to be a little more parent-friendly, but this is why we have to do that. Habitual truancy. So a habitual truant is a student who's been reported as a truant 3 or more times in a school year. Students should not be deemed habitual truants unless there has been a conscientious effort to have at least one conference with a parent or guardian of the pupil and the pupil himself. Sometimes people struggle with this because we've all probably had the situation where we've been attempting to make parent contact and for whatever reason we can't get through. We've tried, we've left messages, the phone numbers changed, we've reached out, we've sent the backpack letters, we've sent the notifications home, we've attempted home visits, we've tried all these things, but even with all of that, we haven't been able to actually make contact with parents. All of those are examples of what would be conscientious efforts to have worked with the family. So I want to make sure that you're clear about that part, because sometimes what happens is people will say, well, I've tried and tried and tried, I can't get through, I can't get hold of the parent, so they feel like everything just stops at that point and they can't proceed. That's not the case. You can still proceed forward to the next steps, but you need to make sure that you've made that conscientious effort and you've documented it in your system. So put it in your Synergy, PowerSchool, Illuminate, whatever your student information system is, document those efforts and proceed. Okay, and chronic truant. This is a term that gets a little confusing for people too, because it sounds like chronic absentee, and it also addresses this 10% thing. So a chronic truant is a pupil who is subject to compulsory full-time ed, who is absent from school without a valid excuse for 10% or more of the days in a school year from the date of enrollment to the current date. So chronic truant is kids who have missed 10% or more of the days enrolled for unexcused reasons, okay? So there's without a valid excuse. Chronic absentee is 10% of the days enrolled, excused, unexcused suspension. Chronic truant is 10% of the days enrolled without a valid excuse. So that's the difference between the two terms. But sometimes it gets confusing because they both start with chronic and they both talk about 10% of the days enrolled, and sometimes we switch our terms, and we just need to be clear about what those definitions are so that as we're talking to parents, we're using the correct terminology for that. Chronic truants are the ones that, going forward with prosecution, these tend to be the cases that our district attorneys are more likely to take forward. I know we'll have a conversation later on about that piece because I think it's been a little more of a challenge. But those are the terms. So in the terms of the chronic absence definition, they're talking about a full day absence for chronic absenteeism. So if they come half the day, you would get ADA for that. They're not counted as a chronic absentee. So that's where, we'll talk about it as we go through, but that's where in talking about like educating parents, if you're gonna take your child out for an appointment, take them out at the end of the day so that they can be there for 4 or 5 periods if you're at the high school level, or for the majority of the day if you're at elementary level. If you have to take them out for an appointment, do it so that they're missing the least amount of instructional time possible, and that way they don't get caught up in any of these other definitions as well. Okay, current context. So now we're going to talk about why we're focusing on attendance, why the heavy push for these pieces, why the updated roles of supervisors of attendance, and why you're here today to be certified by the county. There's been a shift in terms of state and federal focus on attendance, and specifically chronic absenteeism. Again, broader term, more inclusive. This is what we're kind of looking at this point. The Every Student, Every Day initiative came into place under the Obama administration. It was a cross-sector effort between all of these different agencies. So it wasn't just Department of Ed. Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and Housing and Urban Development were a part of this initiative as well. Because what the administration recognized was the long-term outcomes of things related to attendance had an impact in all of these other areas. When kids weren't coming to school, potentially dropouts, they tended to have more interaction with the justice system. They tended to be more of the recipients of Health and Human Services and Housing and Urban Development. So all of these agencies came together with the goal with this initiative to try to decrease chronic absenteeism by at least 10% each year. That was what the Obama administration wanted every school district to try to commit to, was to reducing chronic absenteeism by 10% a year. So what that meant is if your chronic absenteeism rate was 10%, the goal was to get it down to 9 the next year, and then down from that point to reduce it. So thinking about that. Tools and resources, they developed some materials that they shared out with people. The materials are on your flash drive, so you can take a look at those. There is still information online if you want to take a look at it, but a lot of it was already collected for you and is on your flash drive. So if you're interested in any of those toolkits, pieces like that, you'll have access to that through your flash drive. The Every Student Succeeds Act. So this was what basically forced the state of California to start collecting chronic absence data. A lot of times, California is at the forefront of everything new, exciting, and creative. With chronic absenteeism, we were like dead last. We were one of only 4 states in the country that was not collecting chronic absence data. So with Every Student Succeeds Act, it required the state of California to start collecting it. We do that through our CalPAD system now. The information was first released last November that gave us a sense of across the state what our chronic absenteeism rates look like. I will be honest with you in saying that the data collection was not perfect. The reason we still do not have cut scores is because there were some issues with people reporting their data. There were a couple hundred schools who reported that they had 0 chronic absenteeism, which would be awesome if it was true, but even by their own acknowledgement, it wasn't. There were glitches in the system. So as a result of that, we don't have those cut scores yet, and CDE is working with people to make sure that their data is accurate. There is a push by state SARB to try to have the information that we're going to look at in a little bit broken down even further. Because it's one thing to give us chronic absence rates, but what would be even more helpful is to know within those rates how many were excused absences, how many were unexcused, and how many were due to suspensions. Okay, so there is a push by agencies to try to make CalPADs dig a little deeper, give us more information to work with, because those of us who are responsible for taking action with it, that's information that would help us in our day-to-day work. So we're hoping that that becomes the case as we move forward. In addition, at the federal level, we had the Office of Civil Rights taking a look at chronic absenteeism. This was actually data that was put out based on the 2013-14 school year. They define chronic absenteeism a little different than we do. What they call it is missing 15 or more days of school. Ours is the 10% or traditionally 18. What they found, though, in that data was that 6.5 million students missed 15 or more school days a year. So when you break that down, it's 1 in 8 students nationwide. That's an incredible number when you think about it. For those of you that are site administrators, seeing kids every day and wondering how kids are falling through the cracks and what's happening and where do we start, attendance is a really good place to start looking, because students are telling us there's something going on. By not coming to school, there's something going on. Whether it's choices they're making, people that they're around and being influenced by, barriers to them getting to school, mental health struggles, lots of different things. By not coming to school, they're telling us that there's an issue. We have to figure out how to overcome those barriers. At the state level here in California, we had a very active former Attorney General, Kamala Harris, now a state senator, who really focused on truancy and chronic absenteeism. This was an example of one of the reports that she put together, her office put together. We'll pass that around. You can take a look at it. And she was very active in really looking at early elementary level truancy and chronic absenteeism. She kind of put her money where her mouth was. She sponsored pieces of legislation. She created the Bureau of Children's Justice to help address this, and also did a lot of campaign work around chronic absenteeism and truancy. So she was a great support in the state of California, and that really kind of helped push things forward as well. So much to the point that as the State Board of Education was starting to revamp its system of looking at accountability, pieces related to chronic absenteeism were included in terms of the LCAP state priorities. So when we're looking at LCAP, there's really 2 places where attendance comes into play. Under pupil engagement, we look at school attendance rates, chronic absenteeism rates, middle school dropout, high school dropout, and high school graduation. So you can see where attendance plays a role in that. Under school climate, though, we also have to look at that when we're looking at LCAP for those of us doing attendance work, because again, those student suspensions impact attendance. So when we're looking at LCAP, when we're looking at establishing goals and supports related to those things, can have an impact with attendance as well. Priority 5 and 6, again, for those of you that do that work. And in looking at LCAP, it's really pushed school districts with their LCAPs to develop these specific, measurable, data-driven goals related to how we want to improve attendance. The accountability indicator. So in the past, those of us who have been around for a while kind of remember that we lived and died by the API scores. a lot of nodding in the room. I remember feeling as a site administrator every year that my job was on the line based on our school's API scores. So there was a really heavy emphasis on that for years and years and years. And API was completely based on test scores. So it was all about that. The State Board of Education took a wider approach and decided that they were going to look at things beyond just test scores in developing these priority areas. Chronic absenteeism was made a state academic indicator as part of the California School Dashboard. So we are going to be looking at the colored wheels and everything that are on the dashboard. We're going to start looking at that in chronic absenteeism. The thing about the dashboard is it's all about transparency. Anybody can go online. We that work in our districts and our school sites, we see our attendance data all the time. But we're the only people who really have access to it, our school staff. Parents, community members, unless we choose to share it, no one really has access to that information. But because of the accountability indicator on the dashboard, anybody's going to be able to see that now. So community members, your families, you can bet businesses, you can bet that real estate agents are going to be looking at that and saying, hey, here's where you want to live because this school, look at the dashboard and look at the colors and look at it's the reality of what we're going to be living in. So people are going to make choices and decisions. Do I want to be in this district? Do I want to attend this school? Based on some of the information on that dashboard. Not just chronic absenteeism, obviously, but that's going to be a component of it. So the transparency piece and the impact on that for us is going to be really important. In terms of looking at this through kind of an equity lens, as we take a look at our data at the state level, county level, even your district level, and for some of you, your school site level, we have to realize that there are some issues related to disproportionality. We have some groups in our state who have disproportionately high levels of chronic absenteeism, and we need to address that in an honest and real way. We have to look at what are the barriers for some of those groups, how are we as schools going to address that, and when we think about things like our LCAPs, how are we going to put resources towards the subgroups who need more assistance? For example, if you have really high numbers in your homeless subgroup, there may be some barriers that you can easily identify related to your homeless students. Barriers to coming to school could be things like transportation, housing insecurity, food instability. If you have uniforms in your schools, maybe they don't have the uniforms they need, maybe they don't have school supplies. So really identifying and addressing what are the needs of those subgroups that have higher levels of chronic absenteeism, how do we support them? So it may mean that when you're looking at your LCAP and you're looking at where to set your goals, where to put your activities, where to put your money and your resources, you have to look at it through maybe a little bit different lens when you're identifying students who might need more assistance. Okay, questions about the context. And I want to make sure that that's really helps frame why we're doing this, why we're going forward, and where the supervisors of attendance came from. Okay, supervisors of attendance. So we'll start with the certification, why you're here today. Education Code 48245 says that in any district or districts with an average daily attendance of 1,000 or more school children, according to the annual report of the last preceding school year, no district supervisor of attendance shall be appointed unless he has been lawfully certified for the work by the County Board of Education. So this is why you are here today. Some of you may come from districts that are smaller than 1,000 school children. However, we're glad you're here. Best practice is best practice, and hopefully we're going to share some ideas that will help you as well. How many of you in the room have been officially appointed as your supervisor of attendance for your district? Okay. How many of you think you could potentially be appointed as your district supervisor of attendance? Okay, so I'm going to give you a little preview. In part of the definition, we'll go there. One thing I want to point out to you is for all the people in the room who did not raise your hand and you felt like, okay, phew, I'm off the hook, not so much. So here's something I want you to consider because it may end up happening as a result of today or as a result of best practice. The original language related to this comes to us from 1976, so this has been around for a while. The Board of Education of any school district and of any county shall appoint a supervisor of attendance and such supervisors of attendance as may be necessary to supervise the attendance of pupils in the district or county. So these are like assistant supervisors of attendance. So the Board of Education in your district could say not only is there a person we're going to designate as the supervisor of attendance, there can also be assistant supervisors of attendance, additional people to help support with the work. So maybe you felt like, okay, I didn't have to raise my hand, I'm not official. If someone sitting next to you is in your district, they may be looking at you thinking, yes, but you could be. Okay, so some of you at the next board meeting might be appointed to be an assistant supervisor of attendance. It lays out in the education code some of the duties. It says the board shall prescribe the duties of the supervisor and assistant supervisors of attendance, not inconsistent with law, to include among other things, and then it lists some of these pieces right here. So we are going to talk about those pieces. We're going to talk about how this comes into play. But we also want to really focus on the change to law that took place starting January 1st, 2017. So with this slide, I just want to really point out this whole assistant supervisors of attendance, because some of you in here may earn that title. In terms of the need for legislation, based on the definition from the previous slide, when you look at it, again, the focus was really on kind of a compliance piece when you're talking about like work permits, opportunity programs, compulsory ed, and there really felt like there needed to be a shift. So State SARB wanted to update the duties to reflect this shift in focus from to truancy and chronic absenteeism and to identify best practices. The definition that was in place really wasn't sufficient to do that. So in the fall of 2015, State SARB started putting together this language of, okay, what would this look like? If this is what we want, what does it look like? So we actually pulled a piece of legislation that had just been updated about school counselors and kind of used that as a model. And it ended up being sponsored by an assembly person from Long Beach. And his stated reason for sponsoring it was to update it and address attendance supervisors as facilitators of attendance rather than simple enforcement officials. So it kind of shifted from this compliance piece to a more robust definition of what we do. AB 2815 received support from the California Attorney General, Superintendent of Public Instruction, AXA, CASWA, and Children Now. Some of you may be members of some of these different agencies, so we did have the support of AXA and CASWA behind this. The Superintendent of Public Instruction really, in his statement in support of this, talked about the focus of preventing truancy by improving school climate, analyzing chronic absence data to provide early identification for high-risk students, and identified the fact that attendance supervisors are key personnel in the efforts to do this work. So kind of called out the importance of this position. In some districts, supervisor of attendance was also wearing 15 other hats, right? Some of you may feel like that right now, yeah, that's what happens. In doing this, he was really trying to point out that the role of attendance supervisors, because of adding all of these responsibilities and having this really heavy focus, should be a priority position within the district. And in some places, as a result of this, they created new positions so that people could really focus on this attendance piece. Not everywhere, but in some places that happened. It was signed into law by Governor Brown on September 29th of 2016 and took effect January 1st, 2017. I've listed the education codes that it amended just so you have that information for yourselves. And the Superintendent of Public Instruction sent a letter out to all of the superintendents in the state of California to emphasize the changes in the law. So again, not just being supportive of the law, but then sending out a letter personally from him saying, here are the new duties. You need to take them seriously because this person is responsible for this work that California is focusing on. So he really did provide a high level of support for that. In addition to the original language that talked about compulsory ed, work permits, opportunity programs, it added language regarding legislative intent. So it says, it is the intent of the legislature that in performing his or her duties, the supervisor of attendance promotes a culture of attendance and establishes a system to accurately track pupil attendance in order to achieve all of the following. So these are the goals and duties, the updated goals and duties of supervisors of attendance. Okay, so now that we have that, this is what we're going to spend the next little bit of time on, looking at each of these to make sure that everyone is very clear about what the duties and goals are, those updated pieces, what that looks like. Now, when we're talking about the presentation that we're doing right now, as we go through the duties and goals, I really want you to look at this from kind of the global level. I know some of you are here from the school site level, your principals, assistant principals, secretaries, parent liaisons, you have some different roles, but as we go through this piece and we start with this, we're really going to look at it from more of the global level, so think about this from kind of a district perspective. If you are a site person, you may want to jot down some notes and ideas that would be relevant for you at the site level too, but I really want us to think about this from kind of the broader focus as a supervisor of attendance in the big realm. Okay, so the first duty and goal is to raise awareness of the effects of chronic absenteeism and truancy. So on your little chart, it looks like this. What I would like for you to do is think about in this first kind of box right here, how do you raise awareness of the effects of chronic absenteeism and truancy? So I want you to take a little time, think about it yourself. What do you do? And then after you've had a chance to jot down some ideas, I want you to talk with other people around you to get a sense of, is what they're doing the same as what you're doing? Do they have some ideas that you might be able to borrow? We're going to ask you to share out some of those ideas so we can create kind of a bigger brainstorm, and we'll put them on the board over here. But I want you to take maybe 5 or 7 minutes to really think about how are you doing this already? From the perspective of a supervisor of attendance, broader global perspective, how do you raise awareness of the effects of truancy and chronic absenteeism? Okay, So what I want to do is, I was able to hear some of the conversations that were happening around the room, but what I want to do is have you guys kind of share out some of the things that you're already doing to help raise awareness about the effects of chronic absenteeism and truancy, so we can hear what's already happening, what's been successful. And then we're going to go through the slides. I'm going to share some more information from you just based on things I've seen. But I want to start with what the amazing information in the room already is, because I was getting excited hearing some of the things that you were sharing. So Sal's going to help us with writing some of these ideas down. Feel free on your chart to go ahead and add suggestions if you hear things out from people that are things that you would want to add to your own toolbox. But he's going to take notes up here, so at lunchtime or something like that, if you didn't get a chance to copy everything down, you could come take a picture of it or come copy that as well. So we're trying to cover all of our bases. So let's just start. Volunteers from any of the tables, what are some of the things that you do to help raise awareness? Okay, so becoming a member of a group here at the county office that shares information, shares best practices and resources. So being an active member of that so that you're aware of what's happening and can help promote what's happening within the county. So that's a good example. What else do you do to raise awareness about? Yes?
We're going to have a parent night,
Okay.
hopefully speak with parents about the effects of truancy.
Okay. So how are you promoting that with parents?
We're not going to call it an attendance awareness night.
Okay. It's a potluck, right?
I kind of said, maybe we don't say it about attendance because the wrong people will show up, but we are giving away, I think, feeding them that night and giving away some, I think we gave away turkeys last year.
Turkeys this year.
300 or something like that.
Okay. Food will bring people to meetings.
It will get.
Good. Okay, so you're going to start with a parent night, bringing people in, maybe not calling it an attendance meeting, but getting them through the door so that you can talk to them about this. Okay, other ideas. So yeah, all of those are great ideas, and I love the proclamation because it gets, I mean, you can do that with your Board of Education, you can do that with your City Hall, with your mayor, you can do that with your Chamber of Commerce and get your businesses on board. There's a lot of different ways to get the community to support and raise the awareness because businesses really get that, they understand. I want to add a few things in here. One of the things I think it's really important when you're talking about raising the awareness of the effects of truancy and chronic absenteeism is to share data. And to share data, one really good kind of clearinghouse for data is through Attendance Works. So how many of you are frequent flyers on the Attendance Works website? How many of you, okay. If you have not heard of it or you have not yet been online to see their information, they have a wealth of stuff. And like I said, I put some of it on your flash drive, but they're a great clearinghouse for current research and data related to attendance. So some of the things on here comes from Attendance Works, but in talking with, whether it's talking to your families, your staff, your students, your larger community, you want to talk about the data and what it says and the impact of chronic absenteeism and truancy. Yes, it has an impact on your bottom line, on your financials. If you're running a district and running a school, kids who are absent, it definitely has an impact on your budgets. But beyond that, there are some other things that we want to talk about is that chronically absent students in kindergarten score 20% lower on reading and math and later grades, are 2 times more likely to be retained, and 2 times more likely to be suspended by 7th grade. So there are impacts to attendance academically, in discipline realm, moving from grade level to grade level. It's a big concern. The effects of chronic absence on graduation rates is cumulative. With every year of chronic absenteeism, a higher percentage of students drop out of school. So especially, hello, really loud woodpecker out here. Okay, especially for those of you at the high school level, when kids are trying to earn credits towards graduation and fulfilling those credits and graduation requirements, it gets more and more difficult when they're not in the seats. So we have to talk about that, especially at the high school level, that graduation component, that discussion is critical. And that helps when your counselors are talking with families and students and talking about really the importance of coming to school every day. That's one of the best things you can do to help ensure graduation is to be there and be in the seat so that you're receiving the instruction and you don't get behind in your classes. And we know with dropout data, some of the data related to that. So as we're talking again with families, students, parents about the importance of chronic absenteeism and why we're focusing on it, share some of this data with them and talk to them about, you could do an activity with them put some stats up on the wall or something and have them kind of give you feedback and impressions based on what they're seeing. Because in a lot of cases, parents haven't seen this information. They don't realize how much of an impact attendance can have. In terms of attendance, messaging, and marketing, so how do you raise awareness? One of the things, and some of you have talked about it with your coalitions or collaborations, assemble a team of stakeholders together to develop and market attendance slogans or an attendance campaign. What we have up here is the attendance awareness stuff from last year. Again, they have a ton of material that's already pre-prepared that you can use. You don't have to create something on your own. If you chose to create your own attendance campaign or attendance slogan, you could do that within your district or even within your county. If you wanted to have a county-wide campaign, we did that for a few years in Los Angeles. We did a county-wide campaign with our districts. The materials that we developed were used across all of the districts in LA County, so you could do something like that too. Market through traditional media, so thinking about TV, radio, newspapers, billboards, but also social media. How many of your districts are really active on social media? Okay, that's still something people are kind of playing with and getting comfortable with, but there are audiences, particularly the kids, who care much more about social media than they do anything else. So think about, as you're pushing it out there and raising awareness and sharing some of this data and talking about what your expectations are, use both forms of those media. Build relationships with local government and community agencies to promote messaging as well, so they can help address some of these pieces too. We've seen different groups, faith-based community, get very involved with schools and attendance messaging, City Hall through the mayor's office, and different agencies within City Hall. Even your transportation department can help with like bus signs, bus bench signs, getting information out there too. So think about how you can assemble a team within your district, how you can publicize things, and then building relationships beyond just kind of the school parameters to the larger community, and how you can include all of those people in what you're doing. Raising awareness for staff. So again, thinking of this from kind of the global perspective, you want to make sure, especially if you're at the district office level, you want to make sure that you are providing training, or even at the site level, you're providing training for classified and certificated staff regarding attendance. And one of the reasons that you want to do this is because you want to make sure that there are consistent procedures across your school sites. So again, if you're at the district level, one of the things that's probably the most troublesome is sometimes if you look at the websites of your school sites or the materials that are produced for parents, there's a lot of inconsistency from place to place. Distribute attendance-related materials from Attendance Works or other places to school sites, so we kind of brought that up in the back. Report attendance data and progress periodically to the superintendent and school board. That's part of raising awareness, right? Keeping this at the front of everybody's minds. How many of you do that already? How many of you share reports on a regular basis with your school board? One of the things that I've seen that's been pretty powerful visually is within a lot of boardrooms, there's display areas. And what people will do is on a regular basis, they will update attendance data on one of the display boards for the school board so that when they have their school board meetings, they can see the progress of the schools within the district. So it's a way to kind of put it out there, keep it on the board's radar, because if there's a point where you're wanting to look at or ask for additional resources or make adjustments to your LCAP, it helps if the board is used to seeing that data and realizes how public and visible it is. And then the proclamations, we've talked about that a little bit. Raising awareness for students. So publicize the importance of attendance through materials, handbooks, planners, signage. You brought a lot of that up. Develop tools for students to take ownership of their own attendance. So I'm going to pass around a couple of examples. In some of the schools that I've worked with, we have kids take attendance pledges at the start of the year. Middle and high school, they do kind of just a form like this. They sign it, their parents sign it. At the elementary level, what we've done is the big butcher board paper, and we have kids sign attendance pledges. We put our slogan or our sign on it, and the kids will come in and sign their names. We have parents sign their names. We have school staff sign their names, and the big butcher board pledges go up in the hallways or at the front of the school as a reminder about the attendance pledges. So here's an example. Any of this stuff, I think the pledge is on your flash drive, but you can also feel free to take a picture of it. Another example would be a tracking calendar. So this is helping to raise awareness as well for kids, thinking about the days I'm in school and the days I'm out of school. Sometimes it's easy for kids to say, well, I haven't missed that much school, because they're not keeping track of it. It doesn't feel to them like they're missing that much, but in reality, maybe they've already missed 8 to 10 days. But because they were spread out, it doesn't seem like a lot. If they have some kind of tracking tool where in their planner, in their binders, somehow they're keeping track of the days that they've been at school and the days that they've missed, it helps that awareness. And especially if you have a slogan attached to what you're doing, this district that we worked with, the slogan was to strive for less than 5, so to miss no more than 5 days for the whole year. So this way they had a tracking calendar, and they knew when they got to 5, that was it. I mean, we hoped that was it. Didn't always work. We tried. But missing 5 days kept them way below that threshold of chronic absenteeism. So I'll pass this around this way if you guys want to take a look at that. Recognizing students, incentives, we've talked about that a little bit, and then at the district level to support ongoing site level incentive programs. So if there is money available or you have relationships with community members or businesses that can support with turkeys or with any other kinds of incentives that you have in your community, that's always much appreciated. So here's some examples of the tools, but those are being passed around. And then raising awareness for families and community members. So thinking about, talking about the connections between attendance, academics, and graduation, how you're communicating, making attendance a priority at every event. So back to school night, open house, someone said literacy night, math night, anything that you have, build that nexus to attendance. Plan parent workshops that also have that nexus to attendance. Sometimes it's hard to say, come to an attendance meeting, because the people who tend to show up are the people that have kids with perfect attendance. It's not your target audience. So sometimes planning workshops with other topics that have a nexus to attendance can draw different families in. So if you're realizing that a barrier could be something like bullying or cyberbullying, you have kids not coming to school because of that, plan a workshop so that you can talk about what that means. If it's happening, what do parents do? If you don't keep your kids at home, how do you report it? How do you address it? You may talk about health-related issues. If you have a lot of kids missing school for health reasons, you may want to plan a workshop that addresses when do you keep your kids home, when do you send them to school, how do you keep them healthy, work with your school nurses, work with your community-based areas, things like that. And then share your successes out with stakeholder groups. So in addition to the things that you guys came up, those are a few other suggestions of things to think about, but all of that really fits under the raising awareness piece. So as you go back, this is what that first duty or goal really was intended for, and some of the activities that you could do under that. Another thing, this is a graphic that I like to use with parents. When you look at a calendar year of 365 days, generally schools are in session for about 180. That means there's 185 days during the school year when kids are out of school. Those 185 days need to be when medical appointments take place, vacations take place, activities, the stuff that you want to do. That's what parents' calendars should look like. The 180 instructional days should be sacred, and making sure that kids are in school and on time. And sometimes parents just have the impression, the kids are in school from August through May, right? That's a long time. They're in school all the time. The reality is when you look at the calendar, they're in school, or they're out of school more than they're in school. So we kind of have to reframe that conversation with families too. Okay, so looking at the second one, the second duty or goal for attendance supervisors is to identify and respond to grade level or pupil subgroup patterns of chronic absenteeism or truancy. So we have to identify what this means and what this looks like. So on the second, use this again, on the second row of your chart, if you could take a few minutes, talk about in your groups, how do you identify and respond to grade level or subgroup patterns of chronic absenteeism or truancy? So there's two parts to this. How do you identify it? So what do you do right now to identify what those patterns are? And then how do you respond to it? So as you start putting your ideas down, think about that, identify, and then think about respond. All right, so let's share out some of the things that you do to to identify, because there's two pieces to this, identify and respond. So tell me some of the great things that you're doing already to identify and respond to those patterns that you're seeing.
We just signed a CASPA about the Aries Analytics tool,
Yes.
which is super duper handy, and we've started using that. There's more that we can kind of just dip our toe in the water, but even just what we have used has been really useful. It's like if you have Aries, you might have it, but you don't necessarily.
It's like an add-on, yeah, you pay for the extra, yeah. The Aries Analytics.
And then also, if your district, if it chooses to bring for the money for A to A, Attendance Works has a fancy schmancy spreadsheet that
Yes.
allows you to do almost all of the same stuff by hand. It takes longer.
It's the DAT, right? The DATT, yeah.
But it's useful.
So the Attendance Works is another, yes.
One of the things we noticed was using A2A, we noticed a lot of issues with attendance in the preschool TK and K.
The early
So
grades.
last year, we basically made that more of a focus,
Okay.
and we responded a lot earlier and a lot quicker to those things, and talking with the parents, finding out what's going on, you know, and yeah, we did get some pushback. Well, why are you doing this, my kid? You know, we understand that, but this, and we used the materials displayed. You know, this is what happens if this the pattern continues. And some of them, you know, were really shocked by that. Others basically still told us to do it ourselves. So, but you know, we really made that a focus, and with this new dashboard, I think for us the focus this year is really going to be looking at our ethnic subgroups.
Okay.
And really focusing in on what those are.
So you just gave a really nice example of how you identified. You identified those preschool, TK, kinder, and then how you responded to that. You gave a good example of what that looks like and how that plays out. So we have a lot of good, like A2A, Aries Analytics, nurse referrals, teacher referrals, attendance work system. Any other places that you're getting data from?
We run monthly reports. At the end of each attendance month, we run a report for each school site in our district, and then we send that out, and it breaks down 5%, 10,
Good.
5 to 10, 10 to 20 students absent.
And you do that through your own system or through one of these?
We run it out of Synergy.
Out of Synergy? Okay, nice. So some of the student information systems, whether it's Aries or Synergy, have some of those components that are built in, that it's just learning how to use the tools and having the time, like you said, creating the time, sitting down and reserving that time and making sure that you are pushing that out to your school sites to get that information out. Okay, so in terms of the response part, we've talked a lot about identify, how are we identifying it, and then kind of responding. So this gentleman here gave us one good example of how they responded to the early grade type thing, but what are some other examples? You've talked about pushing out information to the school, so that's a way to respond. Other ideas?
No, Jennifer, I could just pick it back up. Randy's, I love his approach. I learned this model called ASK. You know, you change attitudes. You gotta, number one, change attitudes, give them the skill and the knowledge. So it's exactly what Randy's doing. You're providing the knowledge to the parents in order to change their attitudes and giving them skills on how to get the student in time. That's the best approach on how to get individuals to respond positively.
Good point.
We were able to pull like LCAP funds, so one of the things that kind of freaks me out is the whole kids who, you know, are kind of devastated in kindergarten are going to prison basically, like when you track this, you know, pipeline. So they put in like extra LCAP funds for us to do summer home visits to kids who are chronically absent and put attendance contracts in place before they even start school to try and like do some kind of preventative stuff. So when you have some of those, there's somewhere we kind of scratch our heads a little bit, like special ed is one of our problem children that we're not really sure how to respond to, and we struggle with a little bit, but it just gives us where we need to go and hit hotspots. And then when you do have, you know, LCAP now being theoretically fully funded, there's actually money to do some of that stuff.
Right, so I like the response is the LCAP piece. Part of it is once you've identified who the groups are, then how do you as a district identify what your goals are going to be, what your resources need to be, and even positions that could be tied to that to help support the work. So I think LCAP is a really powerful tool that we have to be able to address. And we have the right to be a part of the conversations about LCAP as part of the stakeholder groups and part of the staff. So our voices have to be heard in terms of here's what we need. Because the message back is you can have the best facilities, the best teachers, the best, everything, but if the kids aren't in the seats, what's the benefit? So we kind of have to reframe the conversation sometimes for superintendents and for board members to really focus on this attendance piece as a core element of what we do. Other than LCAP, some of the visits that you talked about, those types of things, running reports, pushing information out, anything else in terms of responses. So sources of data, thank you, Sal. Sources of data, you mentioned a lot of these. You can look at Dashboard now that we're going to have that information available. Look at DataQuest. It breaks things down by ethnic subgroups as well as by other subgroups. Your student information system, so whether it's Aries, Synergy, PowerSchool, Illuminate, any of those. Some of them have add-ons that you can use, and we talked about the Aries Analytics, outside providers, the Attendance Works one, any of those, and then also surveys. So I liked what you said about the nurse and the teacher surveys, but I would also talk about parent surveys, student surveys, staff surveys. Those are sources of data and information about things that they might be seeing within their own students, within their classrooms, what students are self-reporting. So these are all different examples of how you might be able to identify some of the needs of some of the subgroups.